I don't often visit my parents. I try to avoid going there because I really can't stand the incessant questions about my personal life. But they are family, and I try not to alienate them from my life completely. So once every few months I'll indulge them by visiting. They live only an hour's drive away, and most often I go with my girlfriend because she loves spending time with my mother. Shocking for most people, I know. Last weekend, however, my girlfriend had been busy with work and I had already made a promise to my mother that I'd visit soon. I have a Doberman named Luna and I didn't want to leave her alone at home, so I packed her into my car for the road trip. I figured she'd make a good companion for the hour of driving and I could take her for a walk in the park once we arrived. I started the journey and just halfway through I saw a roadblock ahead. I picked up my phone and turned on the GPS, which rerouted me from the highway onto a road which would go in an arc around the roadblock and go right back on the path which I was supposed to take. It said my trip would be around 20 minutes longer that way. Since I had no other choice, I decided to follow the prompt and got off the highway and onto the old, badly maintained road. It was around 2 p.m., so it was still pretty visible, but the weather had started to deteriorate, so adding the bad road to the rain, I had to slow down significantly. The road led between rows of crops until they cleared away and I was faced with industrial buildings far in front, which were part of a town ahead. I checked my GPS and realized that I was still on the right path. However, there was no indication anywhere that I would be going through a town. I shrugged it off and continued driving nonetheless. It was at this point that Luna started barking furiously at something in front. I checked the windshield to see if there were any bugs on there, and when I saw nothing, I squinted towards the town. There didn't seem to be anything suspicious there, so I simply petted her, trying to calm her down. She kept spinning in circles though, clearly agitated by something. Attributing her behavior to the bad weather, I went on and entered the town. After only a few blocks, I saw another roadblock in the middle of the street. Checking the GPS, I realized that it wasn't aware of it, and it instead continued telling me to go forward. I turned left and tried one of the adjacent streets, but it was blocked too. I continued driving, looking for a way through, but all the streets leading in that direction were blocked. I checked the GPS again, but no dice. I was in front of a dental office by this point, so I figured I'd go inside and ask someone there for directions. Luna started barking again, but I told her to calm down and left her inside the car. I went inside the dental office and saw 2 people inside, the receptionist and a janitor. "Hi, sorry to bother you, I'm kind of lost." I approached the reception. The lady outright ignored me, continuing to type something on her computer. I waited for a moment, thinking she was in the middle of something and would respond soon. After around 10 seconds of waiting, I repeated, "Hey, excuse me, I have a question." She continued typing on her computer, completely ignoring me. I turned to the janitor, who was kneeling in front of a chair nearby and fixing it. "Sir, do you know how I can get out? All the roads I checked are blocked." Like the lady, the janitor didn't even glance in my direction. "Sir? Can you hear me?" I said a little louder. The janitor made no response. I thought to myself that people here are extremely rude and went to simply use their bathroom, deciding I would try asking elsewhere. As I finished my business in the bathroom, I went back to the reception and pulled out my car keys out of my pocket. A coin got dragged out of my pocket along with the keys and fell on the floor with a loud clink. Immediately, the reception lady and the janitor jerked their heads in my direction. They had stopped doing their business and were now staring at me with unblinking gazes. I froze, not sure how to react. And then they both stood up at the same time. Not breaking their gazes, they started taking steady steps towards me, the janitor going around the chair and the reception lady around the desk. They didn't even stumble or run into any objects, despite the room being cluttered with a plethora of items. It was as if they knew exactly where to step, despite having their gazes fixed on me. I freaked out and ran up the stairs, which were right next to me. I shut the door and ran through the hallway, opening the next closest one, bursting inside the dental room. As soon as I stepped in, the dentist, which had been working on a patient, and the patient himself with dental cotton in his mouth, shot their heads in my direction, staring like the 2 people below. The dentist straightened his back and the patient stood up, and they both started striding towards me, never blinking and never breaking their gazes away. I screamed and ran back outside and saw the janitor and reception lady, no longer taking slow and deliberate steps, but actively running after me, their faces contorted in anger. I shoved the janitor and he stumbled backwards onto the reception lady. I used that chance to run down the stairs and back outside on the street. It was pouring by now, and I saw more people in the distance, running in my direction with the same intense stares. What scared me the most was the way their facial expressions were. Their mouths were firmly shut, and their eyes seemed angry and hateful. But they all silently ran towards me, not a single one of them uttering a word. I heard Luna's muffled barking from the car, and I ran in, fumbling for my keys. I put the keys in the ignition with trembling hands and turned them. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, grazing one elderly man by his arm. I went right back the way I came and drove out of that cursed town, intermittently glancing from the road to the rearview mirror, keeping an eye on the herd of people running after me. And then I heard a loud bang and my rear windshield broke. Luna started barking even more viciously, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw one police officer pointing a gun towards the car. More bangs ensued, and I ducked down, holding Luna down as I did so. There were a few more bangs that echoed in the distance, and then they stopped. I drove in a ducked position like that for a minute or so before checking on Luna if she was hurt, but luckily she wasn't. I looked in the rearview mirror again. The town was pretty far away, but I saw the townsfolk, probably hundreds of them, just standing in the street and staring in my direction. I turned off my GPS and drove right back home. I apologized to my parents and told them I had some car problems, promising I would visit sometime in the future. On my way back, the people who saw my shot-up car gave me weird glances, and a police officer who pulled me over didn't seem to believe my story, but let me off with a warning after a thorough check. I haven't gone out of town since then, and I think that from now on, if the GPS reroutes me through any unfamiliar roads, I will ignore it and turn right back around. Growing up, I knew that something was off about my childhood town. For one, there was a list of unwritten, but mutually understood, rules that we had to observe. These rules, in all honesty, were pretty much just cultural taboos passed down from the older generation, things like not leaving the rice bucket empty as it is a sign of being poor, and avoid shaking one's legs when sitting down as it symbolizes shaking off good fortune, to name a few. Some of the rules were definitely a little on the creepy side though, like never hanging out clothes to dry overnight because dirty stuff may be attracted to them. But there was one particular rule that had always struck me as odd, I guess. The rule was simple and straightforward. No one is allowed to travel on the road after sundown. It didn't specify which road, but everyone generally took it to mean the twisting, narrow 2-lane road that led down the hill to the nearest city 30 miles away. It was the only connection between the town and the city, so during the day it would often become congested. The more experienced drivers, my father being one of them, would rush to the city and back in the final hours before sunset when the road was less crowded. But no matter what, once night fell, no one drove on the road, not even my father, who'd rather sleep uncomfortably in his car overnight than to attempt the return trip home. One time, I asked him about the rule out of curiosity. He remained strangely quiet for a while before saying, "There are no streetlights along the entire stretch of road, so it is dangerous to drive at night." I could tell from his eyes that he was hiding something else, so I tried pushing the question a little further. "Papa, why don't you just drive with the headlights on?" But my father simply shook his head. "It's too dangerous even with the headlights. Hugh, when you become older and learn how to drive, you'll know why the road is so dangerous." I did grow older, but I never bothered learning how to drive, since my older brother already had a driver's license and inherited our family car. Unlike the rest of us, however, he never really cared about the rules since young, and much less the stupid driving ban, as he called it. My father caught him sneaking out of the house to drive late at night, on more than one occasion, and it only got worse when he started dating a girl from the city. At some point, he just gave up and told my brother in the sternest tone I had ever heard from my father not to call home if he gets into any sort of trouble. My brother, of course, was over the moon. He loved to brag about how wonderful and freeing it was to speed along an empty road without a care in the world, and even persuaded me to go together with him a few times. I refused each time, though it would be a lie to say that I wasn't envious of him. But soon my father's warning became a bizarre reality that I'm sure none of us would ever forget. It all started when my brother told us that he was going to bring his girlfriend over to our house after she had knocked off work at 7 p.m. My father didn't say anything, but my mother uncharacteristically voiced out her concern. "Son, it's best to let her visit during the day. Don't worry, Ma. She'll be staying overnight in my room," he said with a nonchalant wave of his hand. "Can is can, but not today. She won't be free till next weekend. Ma, it's all right, La. It was too obvious what my brother had in mind. I could only admire his tenacity as he hopped into our Toyota and screeched off into the vanishing sunset. Nothing seemed amiss at first, though my father and mother had a small argument in their bedroom that I couldn't room. Meanwhile, I was lying awake on my bed, secretly waiting for the sound of my brother's car to return so that I could sneak a glance at his mysterious girlfriend. There's no way someone with his looks can land a pretty girl was probably the thought running in my head when my ears caught the unmistakable ring of the telephone. Well, to be exact, my next-door neighbor's phone was the one ringing. Not many people could afford a landline back then, especially outside the major cities. My family hence borrowed my neighbor Ismail's phone whenever we needed to make or receive calls. Soon after the shrill ring stopped, Ismail knocked on our door, loudly calling for my father. But despite him being a light sleeper, I couldn't hear the sound of my father getting out of bed to answer the door. I understood then that this was his way of teaching my brother a lesson. Ismail seemingly caught onto it too, because the knocks soon ceased and I heard him walking away from the door. I hesitated, wondering if it was really okay to leave my brother to his own devices and God knows where, before poking my head out of my bedroom window which faced the road outside. "Abang, was it from Kuan?" "Oh, you're awake," Ismail exclaimed, though there was a grim look in his eyes. "Yes, his car has broken down somewhere below the hill. I'm going down to see if I can help him out. Are you coming along?" I agreed without a second thought and got into the front passenger seat of his silver cancel. Once we passed the last row of houses, it was as if the entire world had melted away. All I could see out of the windows was a thick, impenetrable fog of inky black. Ismail seemed unfazed, however. "Abang, you haven't turned on the headlights," I said, panicking when I realized he was driving almost blindly at 60 km/h and increasing. "No good," he replied calmly in Malayu. "The noise is already disturbing enough. The lights will anger them." I didn't dare to ask who exactly were we angering. We raced down the hill for what felt like an eternity in complete darkness, cornering so sharply at each twist and turn that the tiny hatchback seemed to skid on two wheels. It was only until we spotted two flashing amber lights in the distance that Ismail finally put his foot on the brake. "That's our car," I pointed at the Toyota parked by the roadside with its hazard lights on. "Yes, I see it," Ismail muttered. "But I don't see anyone in the driver's seat." But sure enough, when we neared the stranded Toyota, my brother was nowhere to be found. Instead, a girl sat in the front passenger seat, visibly shaken but otherwise unhurt. She didn't seem to react to our presence when Ismail stopped beside the car and rolled down his window. "You all right?" he shouted. When she didn't make a move, he pressed the horn until she finally turned her head towards us. I couldn't quite tell her facial expression because of how dark it was, but an inexplicable shudder ran down my spine when I felt her gaze on me. "Are you here? Dad, T.O. help," she spoke in a bare whisper. "Where's Quan?" Ismail asked back, his voice becoming sharper all of a sudden. "Where did he go?" Her hand slowly gestured towards the pitch-black road ahead of us. Ismail paused for a moment before turning towards me. "You stay here with the girl. I'll go find Quan on foot myself." Wait. Abang, by the time I fumbled with my seatbelt and finally unbuckled it, he was long gone. The only saving grace was that he had left the key in the ignition, so I had the engine idling noise and the meager light from the dashboard to accompany me in the dark. Well, there was also the girl, but something about her felt extremely. "Hui, can you see them?" "There, behind your car." Her whispery voice startled me. I was about to question how in the world did she know my name, but curiosity got the better of me and I turned my head around to glance at the rear window. At first, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to see, but then the hazard lights from my brother's car flashed, and for a split second, I caught something stretching across the width of the road. What the hell was that? The hazard lights flashed again, and I could now make out the something to be shadowy wisps floating in a single row. My scream froze in my throat as the lights flashed once more, revealing 6 distinct humanoid figures standing shoulder to shoulder, and with every flash, the figures came closer and closer, their ghostly appearances becoming clearer and more defined. I was snapped out of my fright by a loud rap on the window. "We, hurry up and unlock the car door." I blinked, and the figures vanished as though they were never there to begin with. Somehow I managed to find the knob to release the door lock in the dark, and Ismail tossed my brother's limp body into the backseat with a grunt. I let out a gasp. Is he okay? He'll live. But they played a pretty bad prank on your brother," he said, settling into the driver's seat and starting the engine. "No choice but to leave your car here, so tell your parents to meet me in the morning. I can drive them down here to get the car back." Okay, I hesitated before gathering the courage to ask, "Who are you talking about, Abang?" "Ah, right, you haven't been born yet when it happened," he said quietly. "Long time ago, this road formed part of a highway that went all the way to the capital. A lot of vehicles from the north used this road to get there, and because of the many sharp turns, it was easy to lose control if you weren't paying attention. Many accidents happened here as a result. One night, a long-distance bus was traveling on this exact road with 7 passengers, all high school students on a holiday trip to the capital. The driver was new to the road, and while overtaking another vehicle, he noticed that there was a bend ahead too late and couldn't stop the bus in time. He pointed at the road ahead absent-mindedly, so he jumped out through the driver's door, and the bus with the 7 passengers crashed right down into a ravine. The ravine was too steep and deep to attempt a rescue, so in the end, everyone on the bus was presumed dead. The bus was never recovered, however, and to this day it's rumored that their bodies are still lying somewhere down there, waiting to be found. That's horrible, I couldn't help but shudder. So just now, those figures must have been. You saw them, Ismail mumbled. How many did you see? How many, I said in surprise. 6. I think something clicked in my mind then, and I started. Wait, one's missing. No, he whispered as he stared at the rear-view mirror, the girl. I frantically turned to check on my brother in the back seat, but a hand shot out and stopped my head in place. Hui. No, Ismail said in a low voice. Don't look. That was the first time I've ever seen true fear in someone else's eyes. Forcing my saliva down my suddenly dry throat, I sunk into my seat and lowered my gaze to the best of my ability. Ismail turned the car around and began the journey back. Yet this time we were struggling to gain momentum uphill even in first gear. It felt like the car had become several times heavier than on our way down, and I was more than certain my scrawny and underweight brother wasn't the cause of it. Abang, what should we do? I muttered so softly that I thought he wouldn't catch what I was saying. They won't hurt us, he answered, though his voice was strained. Then he began murmuring something under his breath, some sort of prayer chant, if I were to guess. The car suddenly jerked from side to side at that very moment, as if something heavy was thrashing about in the backseat. It took every fiber in my being not to scream out loud in panic. I swore I heard laughter from behind before the shaking abruptly stopped. Ismail didn't waste another moment and slammed the pedal to the metal, sending the cancel flying up the road at breakneck speed. If not for his driving experience, I wouldn't doubt for a second that we would have long ended up in a ravine too. It was only when the lights of the town appeared in the distance that we finally slowed down, and when Ismail pulled up next to our house, my father was already waiting by the front door. The 2 men exchanged a knowing look, and after thanking Ismail for his help, my father effortlessly hoisted my brother out of the car and into our living room. It wouldn't be until the next day when my brother finally regained consciousness. Bizarrely, the last thing he remembered was the engine mysteriously dying on the way back home and him exiting the car to open up the hood. He couldn't recall ever calling Ismail to ask for help, and I soon realized there was no way for him to make a call in the first place, since there were no payphones along the road. As for his girlfriend, apparently she had fallen ill and was forced to stay at home, so he didn't manage to meet up with her at all that night. Oddly enough, however, my brother has avoided driving on that particular road since then. It wasn't until recently, when a new highway to the city that completely bypasses the old road was completed, that he suggested going on a night drive together out of the blue. I was so surprised that I agreed without a second thought. It wasn't until I sat down in the front passenger seat that I suddenly remembered the incident from many years ago, and it occurred to me just how strange my brother's change of heart was. "So what's up?" I asked him curiously. "What makes you want to drive at night again, after so long?" "Oh, I never stopped wanting to go on night drives," he said nonchalantly. "It's just that for the longest time, I keep on having the same nightmare about the old road, and it seriously makes me hate driving on that road to my very core." I laughed. "A nightmare? Yeah, it's honestly super weird," he muttered. "It's always the same bus going down the same stretch of road, and I always find myself in the driver's seat no matter what I do." My smile faded. After overtaking a car in front, I must jump out to save myself or else I'll die in a deep ravine. Man, the screams at the end are the worst, I swear. They never fail to wake me up in cold sweat. When people hear my wife's Russian, they imagine a tall blonde girl with a funny accent who wears heels for every grocery run. Reality couldn't be farther from the stereotype. Lana is dark-haired, speaks better English than I do, and is completely obsessed with sneakers. She does meet one stereotype, though. She never gets cold, seeing how she lived in Russia until she was 18. Not in Moscow, of course. Did you know that Moscow's actually pretty warm? There are entire states in America where winters are far colder than anything Moscovites ever have to deal with. No, my wife comes from a tiny town far up Russian north, on the tundra. A dark, gloomy, and a very cold place inside the Arctic Circle, with extremely harsh winters and even harsher people. A place that meets the stereotypes. I've met my in-laws all of 2 times, including our wedding, both times as they traveled to the States. Frankly, I never had any intention of visiting my Lana's hometown until she got that fateful call 9 days ago. My mother-in-law had had a stroke. While her condition was stable for the time being, the local doctor expected the worst could happen at any minute. Transporting her to a better hospital was out of question, as she was in no state for the kind of a journey that you'll see described below. My wife made travel arrangements immediately. I had a valid Russian visa from a business trip to Moscow a few weeks prior, so I decided to go with her. Now, getting to my wife's hometown isn't easy. You're in for a flight to Moscow, then a connecting flight to Norilsk, one of the biggest cities in the Russian tundra. From there, it's an hour-long trip down the Yenisei River by barge in summer and on cars over ice in the winter. Urgently getting to Moscow wasn't that hard. There, however, we faced additional difficulties. First of all, apparently I couldn't actually fly to Norilsk with Lana, as the city was closed to foreigners. Before we could even process that, we were told that Norilsk airport was closed for all aircraft due to poor weather conditions, and the weather wasn't expected to improve that week. I tried to console Lana as best as I could, but news of her mom getting worse drove her crazy. Soon, Lana suggested an alternative. It was possible to fly to a city a fair bit south of Norilsk, which was safe from the storms. For a modest fee, a family friend living there was willing to take a day's journey up the ice road to Lana's hometown. Well, more like a night's journey, since according to him, it was better to travel at night by cars' lights than by what passed as daylight. I told my wife she was insane. She, however, was adamant on her plan, saying she's done Zimnik, how Russians call their ice roads, many times with her dad, and it was perfectly safe. She wouldn't budge no matter how I pleaded, and told me I was welcome to stay in Moscow. Obviously, that was not an option, and in the end I gave up. We flew to our next destination, and the cold hit me as soon as I stepped out of the plane. It was a different kind of cold, invasive and ruthless, and it didn't care about layers of sweaters and socks I had on. I shivered imagining how much colder it was going to get. We met with the trucker who was to take us up north. He called himself Kolya, and my wife Sveta, the Russian version of her name. Me, he didn't call at all, instead referring to me derisively as Mr. Amerikashka whenever he spoke to my wife. Lana told me with a chuckle she didn't tell Kolya I could understand Russian, although I don't think he would have cared. Kolya was supposed to be a few years younger than my wife, but looked much older, his skin and posture worn down by the harsh conditions of his homeland. He laughed at our American shoes and coats and said he would pack extra jackets, woolen socks, and Valenki for us just in case his brother helped load his truck, which looked like it had seen the fall of the Soviet Union. And then Kolya sat down to enjoy a shot of vodka, one for the road. My wife saw me blanch at that. "This isn't New York or even Moscow," she said quietly. "People here are a bit behind in terms of DUI. Don't worry, he won't drink enough to get impaired. He's seen that kill people on the road." Well, indeed, the first shot was the last, and Kolya hopped into the truck. He offered my wife the shotgun seat, which, as far as I understood Russian macho culture, was basically equivalent of throwing a glove in bluff face. Whatever. As long as he got us there. The road was a dark stretch of ice and packed snow, powdered by the fresh snow that had fallen that morning. Snowdrifts bordered both sides of the roads and leaked onto its surface a fair bit. Otherwise, it was the same barren, flat surface for miles. In the first couple of hours, we saw a few cars going the opposite way to us. Then a car going in the same direction as us overtook us and disappeared in the darkness ahead at surprising speeds. It was a freaking tiny, rusted-through Subaru. I gave up on understanding Russians then and there. Shortly after the Subaru guy, it started snowing. Just a bit at first, then more and more. Kolya didn't seem bothered, and I tried to stay calm as well, which I managed mostly successfully until the wind joined in. Unlike the snow, it started hard from the get-go. Have you ever heard wind howling and become unsettled by the sound? Now imagine the same, but in the depths of a black night lit only by your car's headlights. Except for your own vehicle, the world around is silent and devoid of life. Frozen until the spring. Not that you can see much through the thick snow that is now the wind's plaything, flurrying around the car, blanketing the windows. Our pace slowed to a crawl as Kolya swore colorfully in Russian. "Maybe stop and wait it out," I suggested nervously. "We can't," Lana said without bothering to ask our driver. "If we stop, there's a good chance the car won't start up again, and we are stuck here waiting for someone to pick us up." And it's been empty today. The realization we were at a very real risk of freezing to death hit me like a ton of bricks. I leaned back into my seat and closed my eyes, wordlessly praying for the best. The only response was the wind howling, and it sounded so strange. It would start low and quiet, and then get louder and louder until a yowling crescendo, then cut off abruptly, then start again. And the sound came from different directions, each starting at a different time, like a pack of wolves howling. I opened my eyes to obvious tension in the car. Lana and Kolya were both hunched forward, peering intently through the glass for all the good it did them. Kolya glanced back at me. "Don't worry, be happy," Kolya proclaimed with a horrible Russian accent. "It is all okay, don't worry, America." He was lying. I might have been useless on the ice road, but I was a criminal defense lawyer, and a good one at that. And Kolya was a bad liar. There was sweat beading on his face and neck, and his voice was forced. He was very much scared, and that made me scared too. Kolya murmured something to my wife, too quick and quiet for my distracted mind to decipher. She nodded. "What was that?" "There's a village maybe half an hour up the road. If we keep this pace, we get there and settle down until the morning." "I see." Sorry about the delay. In reality, I was extremely happy to hear that. Bad wind? Ha. Lana grabbed my hand, quick and sudden as a snake. "Don't mention the wind." Another sound came through the storm, a long, tinny wail that sent shivers down my spine. It took me a few moments to recognize the familiar sound of the wind whistling through walls and chimney, and then another moment to realize there were no fucking walls around for the wind to whistle. I opened my mouth to comment, and my wife's grip tightened on my arm. In that moment, I knew to keep it quiet. We drove in tension-filled silence as a cacophony of sounds erupted through the storm. Wails and shrieks, howls and cries. No way, no fucking wind was producing all of that. The sounds grew closer, grew louder. I grabbed my wife's hands as we both stared desperately ahead. Through the flurry, we barely made out something, a large, dark shape reflecting our lights, or maybe piercing the darkness with lights of its own. Kolya swore and swerved to the side. We were passing another car stuck in the snow. Its blinkers flashed. "Stop," Lana said, sudden and harsh. "What?" Kolya asked, in Russian. "You insane?" "Stop," my wife repeated. "On the ice road, you help. That's the rule. Remember." Kolya gave her a long, hard look that I didn't like at all. "That's the rule on the road," he echoed, and hit the brakes, slowing the car without actually stopping. I opened the door and peered outside. The driver of the stuck vehicle was already running towards us. I recognized the car itself as the Subaru that passed us earlier. "Thank God you people," where the driver began. "Get in." "Idiot," Kolya shouted, and the guy shut up and jumped in. He was just a kid no older than 20, with dark red hair and a patchy little beard. He looked cold and terrified. "Thank God," he repeated, in a hushed whisper. "I was sure they'd get me." I asked, confused. Kolya and Lana turned to look at the kid in unison, and their looks could kill. "Yeah. I mean the wind and snow," the kid corrected quickly. I had a sudden abrupt feeling that it was too late for that, even as I still had no clue what was going on. We drove on, and the interplay of howls and shrieks outside the car became unbearable in the silence. "What's your name, dude?" I asked him in my best Russian. He blinked. Sergey. Sergey Molchanov. My parents are. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I shouldn't have been driving, but I wanted to make it to my girlfriend's birthday. And both of you shut up, my wife barked. And we did. Immediately I noticed the change in surrounding sounds. They were much louder now. The highest pitched shrieks rang in my ears. The low, insistent howling seemed to surround the car, and every now and then, something that sounded like an actual roar cut through the night. The car picked up the pace. I looked at Kolya and realized he was absolutely flooring the gas pedal. Poor visibility be damned. His truck was lurching along as fast as it could manage in the conditions. And yet the encroaching racket made it obvious we were nowhere near fast enough. Then the car hit something. We were all jerked forward as the truck came to a staggering halt. I hit my temple hard on the back of my wife's seat. "What was that?" I groaned. Must have hit a chunk of ice or something. Lana's voice sounded strangely muffled. I remember focusing on her lips and how pale and thin they looked. The dull, resounding pain in my head exploded into something hot and overwhelming, and I collapsed into the back seat. "He's passed out," Sergei called out. I wanted to correct him, but my voice wouldn't obey me. My lids seemed to weigh a ton each. I could barely open my eyes enough to see the trio of Russians huddled together, the car's flickering light illuminating their pale faces. "What now?" Sergei asked nervously. "Well, let's see, I don't think I would have been able to understand complex Russian in that state if it wasn't my Lana speaking, her voice so familiar down to every inflection. "Why don't you go out and check what we hit? And if we can clear it out somehow." "What?" "We helped you, didn't we, in the car's light?" Lana's green eyes seemed very blue. "So why don't you help us back? After all, on the ice road you help each other. That's the rule." Kolya grumbled in agreement. Then he reached over and pulled out a rifle and aimed it at the boy. Sergei whimpered, "You know they're out there." Well, Lana's voice was impeccably calm. "Cold, I guess you'd better not speak about them out loud then. Better not even think about them, really." My eyes closed against my will. I heard a door swing open and a rush of cold air. Finally, I passed out for real, and in my unconsciousness I dreamed of horrified screaming and a single terrible roar that filled the night. I came to during the day on a couch of some local family that agreed to house us for a bit of cash. My wife fussed over me. Once she was sure I was conscious and lucid, she rushed me into the car saying we could do the rest of the drive by day, and an actual doctor could look at me in her hometown. I settled in the back seat of the car. Vague memories haunted me. "Where's the kid?" "Sergei." "What kid, darling?" Lana asked, in sincere surprise. "There was no kid. We traveled alone," Kolya added, in Russian, and I wondered how he knew what I was asking about, or that I'd understand his answer. But aloud, I could only say, "This young red-headed guy. Sweetie, I'm getting really worried. You must have hit your head harder than I thought. We gotta get you checked out as soon as we get back to the States. Maybe even a good checkup in Moscow." I didn't really know what to say after that. We made it the rest of the way uneventfully. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law had slipped into unconsciousness before we even set out for our drive, and she passed away several hours after our arrival. Lana didn't even get to say a proper goodbye. She is absolutely devastated right now, so I'm trying my best to focus on comforting her. We're staying here until the funeral, and I can't stay. I'm looking forward to the ride back. My father-in-law graciously gifted me a proper Russian winter coat, so I went ahead and packed my American camel coat that proved terribly insufficient for the weather. As I was folding it, I noticed a few curly red hairs stuck to the light beige fabric, and I felt so cold. A very good friend of mine invited a few friends and me over to see his hometown in the Philippines. He was visiting his relatives for a few days, but he wanted to bring us along because he hasn't been back there since he was 7, and he was afraid that he might feel a bit alienated at first. We were hesitant to agree due to the cost of the trip and how rude it would be to intervene in a family reunion. But my friend explained that Filipinos really enjoyed the company and might even let us stay in one of their houses. To top it off, he showed us pictures of a stunning white, sandy beach right next to his hometown, and at this point the offer was hard to decline. We went there a few weeks ago and just got back. What I experienced still haunts me even though we have returned. I was a bit of a skeptic, and I would have probably been the last of my friends to believe old folklore, but it seems the locals provided better explanations than I could at those moments. For our first few days there, we were in Manila, the capital, and these days were some of the most normal. The cities there were pretty modernized and the locals spoke decent English, so we didn't feel that set apart. We spent these first few days tasting the food and getting to know the culture. They were friendly people, but they weren't very chatty. By our 4th day, it was time to go to our friend's place, which was a long way from Manila. In a province called Bicol, we traveled by car, which nearly took us half the day, and the further we went, the more rural the places looked. Vast roads turned into rice paddies and buildings became huts and old wooden houses. The only vehicles on the road were rusty pickup trucks, pedicabs and jeepneys, and our rented Toyota Vios stuck out like a sore thumb. We stayed there for around 12 days, and here were some of our downright creepy experiences. Day 1. We arrived at my friend's place, and his family welcomed us with open arms. There was a simple party with enough food to feed a whole neighborhood, karaoke, which was a Filipino staple, and beer. It was all fun, and everyone was laughing and singing until it started to get dark, and this was when it started to get strange. Immediately after the sun went down at around 6 p.m., they started cleaning up and guests started to leave. It was strange because it was so early and everyone still looked as if they were having fun. I asked my friend why the party was over so soon. and he just said that people in these parts hit the sack earlier, and they say it's not safe to go out at night. The thought of this place not being safe really confused me since the town was small and very rural, so criminals didn't seem like an issue. But I shrugged it off, and we slept in an extra room in my friend's house. Day 2. My friend brought us to his cousin's house down the street. He was close to her as a kid and really wanted to pay her a visit. She was 5 months pregnant and he couldn't wait to see her. But when we got to the house, there were a few men boarding up the windows. My friend yelled at the men in Filipino. I couldn't understand, and one of the men yelled back. My friend explained to us that he was her husband and that we could go right in. We climbed the steps to the door, which were strangely sprinkled with salt, and turned the doorknob, which hung a necklace of garlic. We apprehensively went into the house and I could see his cousin sitting in a rocking chair, her belly slightly bloated. The two cousins chatted for a bit until the strange modifications to the house were mentioned. We were all curious, and she could see that. She spoke in rough English for all of us to understand, and the words she managed to say were, "I'm afraid of the tick-tick." My friend scoffed after that statement, at which we all looked at them in confusion. My friend explained that the tick-tick was an old Filipino legend of a humanoid monster with a long tongue, which it used to suck out fetuses from the mother's womb. 3 things deterred the tick-tick and other Filipino monsters: salt, garlic, and anything blessed by a priest. Like my friend, I didn't think anything of it, but the fact that the locals would go through all this trouble meant that there must be something more to it. We went on our way and said goodbye to my friend's cousin, but that wasn't the last we were to see of her. Day 4. We were starting to get bored, so we decided to go to beach. It was beautiful with crystal clear waters and smooth, white sand. The only thing strange was that there was nobody out there swimming, and everyone stayed well away from the water's edge. When we tried to get in the water, a fisherman went over to us and shouted at us to stay away. My friend went over to talk to him. The fisherman told him that a little boy went swimming in these waters the other day and went missing. When the boy's friends were questioned, they told the parents that he was pulled down into the water and dragged by the ocean. There were some who speculated it was the work of a shokoi, a sea monster who drags swimmers into deep water to feast on their flesh. This was the second time a monster was mentioned to us during our stay. Though we didn't necessarily believe him at the time, we still didn't swim as respects to the missing boy. That night, we ran a little late getting back to house, and as we rode a jeepney, the sun went down and it was pitch black aside from the headlights made by the vehicle. We passed by a man walking alone beside the road, and when he saw us, he raised his hand, gesturing us to stop. The jeepney driver kept going and ignored the man. I told my friend to ask the driver why he ignored the potential passenger. My friend told me that the driver didn't pick up people this late, and that the driver feared that they might not even be people at all. Day 5. We woke up that day and were surprised to see that none of our stuff was as we left them when we fell asleep. Our bags were wide open, and all the clothes were thrown around the room. The pillows were on the floor, and the shoes were on the bed. The room was just in complete chaos. My cousin called for his grandfather, whom owned the house, to see the mess. He looked around the room and chuckled. We asked him what he was laughing about. He whispered something to my friend, who translated his message. He told us that the children must have gotten into the room. It was strange since we never saw any children in the house before. I asked the old man if they had kids in the house, and he managed to make out the words used to. After this experience, I grew ever fearful of what this town had to hide and how much truth these legends had. Day 7. A couple of days ago, we learned that nobody went outside of their houses at night in fear of some strange things, but it turns out not everybody followed that rule. That morning, the whole town was distressed as the body of a teenage boy was found beside a clump of banana trees near a densely wooded forest. He had been impaled by a sharp piece of bamboo sticking out of the ground. He was supposedly with a girl that night, but no trace of her has been found. My friend had overheard some gossip from the townsfolk and explained what the locals thought had happened. It turns out the two had been seeing each other behind their parents' back, as teenagers do, and that these two teenagers weren't particularly superstitious, so they arranged meetups at night, despite the elders warning them of the dangers of going out after dark. It is said that a colony of encantos, which are sort of like fairies but a lot more sinister than those in the fairy tales, lived in those banana trees. The prince saw the young lady and wanted to take her as his bride. These creatures had the ability to control nature, so the prince made a bamboo grow out of the ground and stabbed the boy in the chest. He took the girl away to the land of the Encantos, where she is forever trapped. Normally, I would just brush these stories of as nonsense, but after all that I've heard, I don't know what to believe. Day 9. We didn't do much that day because one of my friends caught a terrible fever. He was burning up, and the nearest drugstore was miles away. Without our knowledge, my friend's grandfather called in a witch doctor, and from my first look at him, I knew he was nothing more than a quack. He was a frail old man who looked as if he needed the medical attention. With him, he carried a basket of leaves, herbs, candles, and other junk. I didn't want him to touch my friend because I feared it would only make him worse, but the family insisted, and we let the doctor into the room. He felt my friend's forehead, and he asked him to take off his shirt. My friend was sweaty and pale as the quack rubbed a bunch of leaves on his back. The doctor faced the family and asked them for something. My friend ran over to stop them, but his family reassured him and he sat back down. I asked him what happened, and he said that the doctor asked for the juice of a 1-day-old puppy. I was surprised and confused and was unable to speak at the thought of it. An hour later, a relative arrived with a bowl of slimy red liquid. The doctor grabbed it and mixed in some herb, which looked a bit like mint. He held it in front of my friend's mouth and made him drink it. I nearly barfed at the horrifying sight, but couldn't speak due to utter shock. The doctor stood and left the room, as did my friend's family. When we were alone, we argued among ourselves on why we would let that nut even touch our friend. We stopped as our friend slowly sat up and looked at us with his normal reddish, tan skin. He no longer felt warm, nor did he show any signs of ever being sick in the first place. The doctor cured him. I don't know how, but he did. Day 10. This was a Sunday, and when we woke up in the morning, my friend's family was already urging us to go to church. The church was Catholic, and they kept the doors open to let the air in, which made sense in the warm climate. A few of my friends and I, who weren't Catholic, stayed outside while pretty much the rest of the town was in the church. It was about midway through the service when an old man arrived. He just stood outside, staring at us with a creepy grin. The townsfolk started to notice him and immediately gestured for us to go inside. We followed. Once we were through the doorframe, the man's grin disappeared. Everyone was just staring at him, wondering what he would do next. A few minutes later, he left, and the mass continued as if nothing ever happened. We went over to our friend and asked who the hell that was, and he told us nobody knew. I asked why the whole town seemed afraid of him if they don't even know him. He simply replied, "In such a small town, not knowing somebody is scary." I still had a lot of questions in my mind, but decided to keep them to myself. Who was that man? Why was he intently staring at us? And why did he not follow us into the church? Day 11. We were woken up by the sounds of screaming coming from a few houses away. It was early, around 3 a.m., and the whole town ran out of their houses to see the commotion. It came from the house of my friend's cousin. We ran over there, still in my pajamas, to see a decently large crowd gathered in front of their house. The husband was climbing down the steps, frantically shouting something in Filipino. My friend looked over at my other friend and grabbed her shoulders. He told her that they needed medical attention. She nodded and walked over to frightened man with the rest of us following closely behind. She tells the man that she's a paramedic, and he grabs her hands, tears flowing down his face, and yells "Salamat," which is one word I actually know. It meant thank you. He leads her inside the house, and we quickly follow. The woman was sitting on the rocking chair, her face wet from tears and sweat. My friend does a quick checkup of her, feeling her belly and asking her questions while my other friend translates. After a moment, my paramedic friend looked up at us, horrified. "Her baby is gone," she said. The rest of us were just in shock. She asked the couple if they had a miscarriage, and they denied. She told us that there were fresh puncture wounds on her belly button, as if someone poked a large syringe through it. This puzzled us, as there was no way any intruder could have gotten into the house since they boarded up all the windows and the couple said they had locked the cert. It started to rain outside, and I noticed the ceiling started to leak. I look up and saw that there was a golf ball-sized hole on the roof. I asked the couple about the hole, and at first they seemed confused, like they didn't know they had a very noticeable hole on their ceiling. When the woman saw it, she got down on her knees and cried. She kept shouting words in Filipino, constantly yelling out "tick tick," which was the only word I understood. When the sun rose, my paramedic friend and Filipino friend stayed in the house while the rest of us left. I could never forget what had transpired in that house. Day 12. This was the day we left, and to be honest, I was relieved, but I was also frustrated. We didn't leave with happy memories or refreshed spirits. Instead, we were left with questions about the town where my friend had spent his childhood. But perhaps the biggest question that bothered me is, if there were any other towns like this in the Philippines, or if all of them were just like this town. I guess these questions won't be answered now, and I don't know if I'm ever coming back. We left the town, and as our car drove away, we looked back to see all of the locals waving their hands in goodbye. They looked as if they were relieved that we have left. Eat it. A commenter corrected me saying that Bicol was a region, not a province. I looked it up, and she was right. Sorry for my mistake, I don't know much about the country's geography. To all those out there who live in areas near wide stretches of empty land like I do, I'm sure you've already been warned why it's dangerous to travel rural roads at night. Growing up in Seattle, one of the biggest cities on the West Coast, I never really needed to worry about the dangers of driving through the middle of nowhere until I committed to a college in Eastern Washington. To those who have never been here, the eastern side of Washington is so different from the western side that some may think they accidentally took a wrong turn into another state. Primarily used as farmland, Eastern Washington is almost completely absent of all the elements that give the other side its famous reputation as the Pacific Northwest. Plentiful forests, constant rain, bodies of water. Instead, this side is mostly just rolling fields of wheat and dried grass that stretch into the distance with a distance of few tumbleweeds and windmills here and there. Driving through this area when the sun's still up can actually be quite pleasant on a nice day. The big sky above and nothing but miles and miles of golden hills on each side of you. Unfortunately, driving through Eastern Washington at night is actually one of the most nerve-wracking experiences I will ever have, and here's why. If you've ever had to drive a country road at night, I'm sure you've already been lectured by everybody and their mothers on the obvious dangers like drunk drivers, falling asleep at the wheel, and animals suddenly running across the road. In my particular area, we have a lot of issues with head-on collisions due to ANSI students passing cars recklessly in an effort to get home faster. In addition to these more sensible hazards to be aware of, there's also the famed superstitions like the ghost murderous hitchhikers that wait on the side of the road at odd hours of the night begging for a ride. To top it off, probably the most dangerous part of traveling these rural roads to keep in mind after sundown is the fact that there is no cell service throughout a massive part of the area. So basically, if anything happens to you out here, you're fucked because you'll have no way of contacting anybody for help. There's no civilization around for who knows how many miles, and the chances of another car coming by any time soon is pretty slim. With these dangers in mind, it's safe to say that the story I have for you is about an occurrence that I hope never needs to be warned of again. Now, let me begin by saying the creepiest thing about driving through these empty farmlands at night is by far the lack of light. With no need for any street lights in the middle of nowhere and no towns or cities anywhere nearby for the majority of the trip, the only light besides those your headlights provide is that of the stars and moon above. It's a surreal experience looking out your window and seeing only darkness beyond the railing on the side of the road, mostly because you have no idea of what could be out there. And that's precisely why you should be the most scared of driving country roads at night. One day, my boyfriend and I were driving home from my cabin in Eastern Washington when I noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road. When we passed the car, I noticed it was completely empty and wondered where the people inside could have gone, considering there was nothing even remotely in walking distance from where we were. I figured they had run out of gas and hitched a ride to the nearest town, but my theory of where they had gone prompted my boyfriend to tell me a story that I will never forget. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Washington State had a bit of a cult problem. This wasn't the first I was hearing of this, considering the fact that one of the church camps I went to when I was younger was oddly enough built on the grounds of a disbanded satanic cult, LOL. Who made that decision? Anyways, most of these cults resided over on the east side because of how far away it was from literally everything and everybody. These cults could basically do whatever they wanted and fly completely under the radar due to the fact that there was nobody around to stop them. Because a lot of the time, nobody even knew they were out there. And that's why they were able to get away with what they did. One summer morning, a police station in one of the few tiny towns amongst the farmland received a call reporting a missing person. The caller claimed their husband had not returned from his shift at the paper mill the night before, and she was worried he had gotten into an accident because he hadn't answered her phone calls. Many of the residents in these small towns commuted to jobs way out in the country land because many of them were either farmers or workers at the local paper mill, so accidents at night were not uncommon. The station agreed to send out a patrol car to look for him along his route to the mill. At one point along the road, the officer noticed that one of the speed limit signs had disappeared and noted that it may have been the cause of the missing person's presumed accident. Local kids must have been bored, but what else did they have to do out here? The man's car was found pulled off to the side of the road about halfway through his commute without a single scratch on it. He was nowhere to be found, but his car was unlocked and his wallet and cell phone lay in plain view on the passenger seat. Something definitely did not seem right. After weeks of investigation, the man was still missing, and nobody had any idea where he had gone. For several days, the police station anxiously awaited any news that could solve the mystery behind the disappearance of the man. But because of the usually uneventful nature of the area, the only report called in was that of another missing speed limit sign. Stupid kids. A few days later, the phone rang once more. There was another missing persons report, almost identical to the one before. Somebody hadn't returned home from their shift the night before. The police sent out a patrol car once again, and sure enough, there it was. An untouched abandoned car on the side of the road with the missing person's belongings clearly left behind. But this time, there was something different. Faint scratch marks could be seen on the driver's seat that trailed onto the floor and out the door. Had somebody been dragged out of their car? This realization of possible assault or abduction raised great alarm, and an announcement was made to all local residents to lock their doors on their commutes home at night. Be extremely cautious of anybody who may try and approach their car. One night around 2 a.m. the station received a call that would answer their disturbing question of where these people disappeared to. A couple had been traveling the road where the people had gone missing that night, and had just narrowly escaped the fate of those before them. They had fortunately heard the announcement a week before and made sure their doors were locked and kept an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. Apparently, a few minutes after they had entered an area void of any cell service, they noticed a single ray of light that appeared to be floating directly in the middle of the road just a ways down the route. Confused as to what this could be, the couple slowed down cautiously. As they neared the source of the light, they saw something that probably gives them nightmares to this day. Standing in the middle of the road was a chain of people, linked together arm in arm, creating a barrier in the street. The man in the middle held a flashlight in his teeth. The car came to a complete halt. There was no way to go forward. Then, in what seemed like a split second, after they had stopped the car out of the complete and utter darkness on each side of the road, 2 people leaped over the leaper, ran towards the car, and tried to rip the doors open. The human chain had been a distraction. Thankfully, the doors were locked this time, and the husband frantically switched into reverse and slammed on the gas pedal. They got away, and had immediately called the station once they regained service. When the police asked if they'd seen where they'd gone as they drove away, they simply answered with back into the darkness beyond the road. An investigation occurred, but the people in the road were never found. To this day, nobody knows who these people were or where they came from. They eventually did find the bodies of the missing people, though. Both victims were found bound to what looked like the stolen speed limit posts and severely burned. What could be the reasoning behind ripping people from their cars at odd hours of the night and burning them alive out in the middle of nowhere? Without explanation, the police chalked it up to cult activity. But how could it be possible that there was no trace of these people anywhere? It is almost as if they vanished into thin air. What's almost more disturbing is the fact that for all we know, they could still be out there. We just don't know. All I can tell you is to think twice next time you're driving a country road at night and mindlessly staring into that deep darkness just beyond the railing. You never know who could be staring back.